Okay, so Shabbat Shalom, everybody that's here, those that are online, and those that are watching later. This week's parsha, we are starting the second book of the Torah, Shemot. And this portion is called Shemot or Exodus. And Shemot literally means names. And so it's going to start in Exodus 1 and goes through chapter 6, verse 1. And so, for those who are wanting to join us online, live on Shabbats, it's at 1 p.m. and you can email me and I can get you on the Zoom link. So like I said, this week's portion is the second book of the Torah, and we call it Exodus, but it's actually names. Shemot, Shem means name, so it's names. And so this parsha begins with the tribes still living in Egypt, and the life of Moshe starting from his birth to, the killing of the Egyptian, his marriage, and returning, back to Egypt from Midian. So we know the story. And so this year I wanted to step back and look at a bigger picture and sort of like do a 30,000 viewpoint, where you're zooming out and looking at what all is happening. So first of all, I'm going to go a little bit more into summarizing and then we'll start. So it opens, like I said, with the children of Israel, the Israelites multiplying in Egypt, becoming enslaved under this new Pharaoh who fears their numbers are growing. And Pharaoh orders that the Hebrew midwives to kill the newborn baby boys, but they refuse. And we see that a Levite woman hides her baby, Moshe, until he's later discovered and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And as an adult, we see Moshe, kills an Egyptian, and he flees to Midian, where he marries Zipporah. And while he's tending sheep, he encounters Yah in the burning bush, and he's commanded to return to Egypt to free the Israelites. And Moshe and Aaron confront Pharaoh, and who responds by, the Israelites increasing numbers, and they increase their workload, and it leaves Moshe discouraged, and the parsha ends with Yah promising that redemption is about to begin. So now that we got an overview of what happens here, there's a theme that I think that we often miss, that we think of Exodus just being a journey of the Israelites from Egypt, but it's actually a recreation story. And we often don't see, but there are this repeating pattern of creation, and then creation sort of goes into like a decreation mode, or it becomes corrupt or whatever. And then Yah does a recreation. Think about like with Noah and the flood, and then they go off the path again. And then there's this corruption, decreation, and then we have a recreation again. So as I go through this parsha, I want to bring out some of the comparisons with the patterns of the creation account in Genesis. And so a lot of the research, is what I've been studying from the ancient Near East from Dr. Christine Hayes, Rico Cortez, Dr. Cameron Imes, Dr. Deanna Dye. So, all of those are big into the ancient Near East and looking at, not only history, but archaeology and the discovery of understanding what's happening. So I'm going to be, instead of reading through the whole parasha, I'm going to be pulling out specific points and us looking at them and discussing them. So as we go back, I first want to go back to the creation story. So let's go to Genesis 1. And let's look at the beginning of the creation story here. So Genesis 1:1, we see that Yah is going to bring order out of this chaos, or really non-order. He's going to bring light from darkness, land from the sea, and he fills it with all kinds of creatures, and he declares it good. But like I said, it doesn't stay in this state long because sin enters in it. And so this is where that creation breaks down or is like decreation, and Yah restores it again. So Genesis 1:1, we see, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the earth was unformed and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the water. And then God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. Okay. Now, one thing I wanted to point out here is in verse 4, where it says, God saw that the light was good. In Hebrew, it's Vayere Elohim et haor ki tov. Okay, he saw that the light was good. Now, so he called the light good. And we've already talked about this back when we did parsha on Genesis, Bereshit, that this is a picture of Yeshua. Okay, now let's compare it to this week's parsha. So let's go over to Exodus chapter 2 and look at verse 1. Exodus chapter 2 and verse 1. Okay. A man from the family of Levi took a woman, also descended from Levi, as a wife. And when she conceived and had a son, and upon seeing what a fine child he was, she hid him for 3 months. Okay. Now, we miss what's being said because we're reading it in English. And I'm going to read this. Well, I'll just say this. Okay. And first of all, when we look at this in the English, we're reading that Moshe was a fine, goodly child. Okay. So we tend to think of like, oh, he's this chubby little baby with these big round cheeks or whatever, that he's this cute little baby. But I'm going to read that verse 1 and 2 in Hebrew. And it says, Vayelek ish mebet Levi, vayika et bat Levi, vatahar haish vateled ben vetere oto ki tov hu. And okay, so hopefully I'm going to stop right here. Did you hear what I just said? He was ki tov. Remember what we said in Genesis 1. The light was ki tov. So we have Moshe being described in the same words that we have the light back in creation. It's linking back to creation. And so really what's happening is we've got this recycling of this recreation language, and it's just putting it now into a different context. And it's demonstrating to us that Exodus is a recreation narrative. And what Moshe is going to do in getting the children out of Egypt, the children of Israel out of Egypt, is actually a recreation act. Now, it's not creating land, it's not creating seas or animals or anything like that. But what is he creating? He's creating a nation. And it's that same concept, that same thing. And so God is really positioning Moshe here as the light of the world. He's calling him by the same phrase that is in reference to the light of the world, this ki tov. And so Moshe is a type of Messiah in Exodus. He's the mediator between Yah and man. I want to go over to chapter 34 in Exodus. So Exodus chapter 34 and verse 29. Okay, and it says, when Moshe came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of testimony in his hand, he didn't realize that his skin on his face was sending out rays of light as a result of his talking with Yah. And when Aaron and the people of Israel saw Moshe, the skin of his face was shining and they were afraid to approach him. So again, this is showing us this, taking it back to creation, that Moshe, when he was in the presence of Yah, his face shone like light, just like he was basically Moshe was like the light of the world, just like Yeshua was the light of the world in Genesis 1. And we even see in in John chapter 8 and verse 12, what does Yeshua say? Yeshua says, I am the light of the world, and that whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light which gives life. So what Yeshua is saying in the book of John is not something new. It's connecting you back all the way to creation. And it's that pattern that's coming over and over again. And I think Ryan Wyatt's the one who pointed out, he was like, Exodus doesn't really begin with slavery, because the children of Israel willingly went down to Egypt on their own. They were fleeing, because of famine, but they went down there on their own. They weren't conquered by the Egyptians and brought into slavery there. And so, I think here's a lesson for us, and it's something, I've discussed, the last couple of weeks too, is that, what drove them there was the famine. Yah sometimes puts us in a hard position so that we can learn from our mistakes. And yet, while we are in that place, because Egypt, Mitzrayim, means dire straits, or, and so while we're there, where is our focus? Where is our attention? And, because because when they're there, what happens? They start prospering. They're living very wealthy. They're not really slaves yet. And if we're content to be in Egypt, if we're content to be there prospering, then Egypt is our home. But yet, if our hearts are longing to return to the land, then Israel is our home. And that's something, Eddie and I have talked about a lot, is that no matter that we're here and we're living here in the States, this is not home. That's not what I consider home. And because there is always that longing to go back to the land. There's always that longing to be in Israel, because it's more than just that physical place. It is that spiritual connection that Yah did there. And I understand that that's where my inheritance lies. And so it is that constant longing to go back. Did you want to say something? No. Okay. So, even you think about when the children of Israel were even in Babylon, there's a verse in Psalms, and this is a song too, Psalms 137, verse 1, that's, shows that, there were some that while they were there in Babylon, what were they doing? They were longing to return back to Jerusalem, back to the land. Because in Psalms 137, verse 1, it says, by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. And, then it goes on to talk about how, they were commanded to sing these songs of joy. And he's like, how can we sing these songs when our heart is longing for Zion? And, we know that historically, there are many comfortable living in Babylon that don't return. And we see this today. That's why there are so many Jews that are still living outside of the land of Israel. And I just saw an Orthodox, Rabbi Josh Wander, and he wrote an article about how he was basically condemning. He's like, why are you choosing to live in exile because you have the right. You can return to the land. Why are you choosing to still live in exile when you can come back? And so it's that longing. And there's, just like when they were in Babylon, there were many that chose to stay in Babylon and didn't return. But there will always be a remnant that is longing to return. Isaiah chapter 10 and verse 20 starts, on that day, the remnant of Israel, those of the house of Yaakov who've escaped, will no longer rely on the man who struck them down, but they will truly rely on Yah, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, the remnant of Yaakov, to the mighty God. For although your people Israel are like the sands of the sea, only a remnant of them will return. Destruction is decreed, overflowing with justice. So, the question is, for the most of us, all of us that I know that are on here, are living in Egypt, really. But where is the focus of our life? Where are we focused? Are we content to be where we are, or are we longing to be in his land and in his presence? So, okay, so going back to the story, Yah did have a purpose for them being in Egypt. And, he's beginning to recreate things. And like I said, I'm going to look at those patterns there. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 1, and I'm going to go to verse 27. Okay, Genesis 1 and verse 27. So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, and every living creature that crawls on the earth. So this picture of what's happening in Exodus is also a picture of what's happening. In Genesis is also a picture of what's happening in Exodus. If we go to our parsha, Exodus 1 and verse 5. Okay. All told, there were 70 descendants of Yaakov. Joseph was already in Egypt, and Joseph died, as did his brothers and all that generation. The descendants of Israel were fruitful, increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew very powerful. The land became filled with them. Okay, so think about what's happening. Just as God created them and he created them to multiply and be fruitful, what happened when they were in Egypt? They were starting over again. Yes, they're there. Here we've got them. He's got a purpose for them being there, and they are to be fruitful and multiply. That same language. Now, it says that there were 70 descendants of Yaakov that came into Egypt. And remember, there were 70 years of the Babylonian exile. And so 70 is a number that represents the fullness of the world. Because remember too, at Sukkot, when you count up for the whole festival of Sukkot, all of those days, how many sacrifices there were? There are 70 sacrifices at Sukkot. And so Sukkot is considered a feast for the nations. And so this story of creation with Moshe is the creation of a nation. And so we can see that he's got 70 descendants there. And Yah showing that the children of Israel is going to be, they're going to be, Ephraim is called to multiply, and that they're going to be from all the nations. In Genesis 48 and verse 17, we see Yaakov's blessing over Ephraim. And it says, when Joseph saw that his father was laying his right hand on Ephraim's head, it displeased him. And he lifted up his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head and place it instead on Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, don't do it that way, my father. for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know that, my son. I know it. He too will become a people. He too will be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will grow into many nations. So he's talking about Ephraim. Ephraim grows into many nations. And that phrase for many nations, we've said this before, is Melo HaGoyim, which is the same phrase that's used in Romans 11, talking about the fullness of the Gentiles. Because it says, 11 and 25, for brothers, I want you to understand this truth, which God formerly concealed, but is now revealed, so that you won't imagine that you know more than you actually do. It is stoniness to a degree that has come upon Israel until the Gentile world enters in its fullness, or the fullness of the Gentile. So that's Melo HaGoyim. Now, if we think back, so what he's saying with Moshe is that I'm recreating this nation, but this nation is literally going to make up all of the nations of the world. They're going to come from all of the nations. But think about where the children of Israel are living. They're inside of Egypt, but they're living in Goshen. So they were separate, but they were still inside. Just as today, there's going to be one nation, Israel, living inside of another nation, Egypt. And so that's where we are today, that we look at ourselves as Israel, but we are living here inside of another nation, Egypt. Now, going back to Exodus 1, remember what Pharaoh says in verse 9. He says, but to these people, look, the descendants of Israel have become a people too numerous and powerful for us. And what stood out to me in this verse is that this is the first time that they're really considered a nation. They're called a nation, a people. Literally means like a nation here. So in the midst of being in a foreign land, these individuals came together and they became the nation, the Israel, the people of Israel. And so here Pharaoh is declaring, basically, you fulfilled your promise because you've made them into this great nation. And now they're too numerous that they're going to become more powerful than us. And we see this theme of this creation linked with the birthing process, because creation in Judaism is not considered just the event in Genesis. It was not just something being made and created. It was something birthed. And where do I get that from? If you go to Genesis chapter 2, sorry, my nose starts itching every time I get online. Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. And again, this is where we miss it in English. It says, here is the history of heavens and earth when they were created. On the day when Yah Elohim made heaven and earth. Okay, so we read that in English and we miss it. But the Hebrew word for history is actually toldot. And toldot comes from the root yalad, which means to give birth. Like we have the word yeled, a child. And so when we look at Exodus here, the birth of the nation is really going to take place, but where have they been living? They've been living in Goshen. So Goshen is like the womb, and it is going to be out of that they're going to be birthed. And we know, going back to the parsha, Exodus 1, that the children of Israel are shepherds. Okay. Exodus 1:10, come let us use wisdom in dealing with them. Otherwise, they will continue to multiply. And in the event of war, they might ally themselves with our enemies, fight against us, and leave the land altogether. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built for Pharaoh the storage cities of Pithom and Ramses. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more they multiplied and expanded until the Egyptians came to dread the people of Israel and worked them relentlessly, making their lives bitter with hard labor, digging clay, making bricks, and all kinds of field work. And in this toil, they were shown no mercy. So they were shepherds in the land, but now they're living in Egypt in exile, and Pharaoh is making them a builder, and they're building these storage cities of Ramses and Pithom. And Ramses and Pithom had several temples to gods that, they worship, like Ra was the sun god, Seth, which was the god of the dust and the earth. And Ramses actually means Ra, and the mem, not the mem, I'm saying it in Hebrew, the MES, the end of that, which is part of Moses's name, means to give birth. So it's Moses's name is really saying like that he was birthed, that here he was being birthed, and that he came from the Nile, and they're looking at like the Nile birthed him, with the Nile as a link to the god Ra. And so Pithom means house of a tomb. And, Ramses or Ra was also known as another name, a tomb. So, because in Heliopolis, in the city of Heliopolis, if you start looking at the archaeological evidence there, Ra is referred to as a tomb. So now we've got a picture of the Israelites who were shepherds are building something that is basically, the pyramids are dedicated, and these storage cities are going to be dedicated to another god, Pharaoh, the sun god. And in the English, it called these two cities storage cities. And I found this interesting because in Jerusalem, right, the oldest neighborhood outside of the city walls, the old city walls, was actually a Jewish neighborhood that was started in the 1800s, and it was called, this was, later because of all the destruction, but this was because remember, they couldn't come into Jerusalem, couldn't go to them for over 2,000 years, really. To the wall. But here we've got the oldest Jewish neighborhood outside of the old city walls was in this area of Yemen Moshe. And it's actually right at Yemen Moshe that there's the little village there that is called Mishkanot Hashanim. And so what's interesting, and that I linked it here, was that these storage cities in Hebrew are called miskanot, which is plural. And if you look at the singular of that word, miskane, there's sort of a play on words here, because in the book of Exodus, we also see that Yah gives the commands for the children of Israel to build the tabernacle. And the Hebrew word for tabernacle is mishkan. And so while mishkan is singular and mishkanot is plural, those two words, like mishkanot being storage cities, are nearly identical. The only difference is the tabernacle, mishkan, is spelled with a shin, okay, this letter, the shin, but the mishkanot is spelled with a sin. Okay, the same letter, the only difference is I covered up the dot. Okay, because this letter is shin, but if you take the dot away, it's going to be sin. Okay. So this word here, the Mishkan is spelled with a shin. Mishkanot is spelled with a, sorry, it's not spelled with a shin, sin. Let me start over. Sorry. Got it. Mishkan is spelled with a shin, that letter, okay? Mishkanot is spelled with a samach, which makes that S sound. But the shin can make the sh sound or the s sound, the S sound. So depending on how it's read. So you can actually read the word Mishkan without vowel pointings as Mishkanot, if you made it plural. Because if you didn't know what the vowel pointing was there, it would be the same word. So Yah is actually doing a play on words with what they're building. So the children of Israel in Egypt are building these storage cities, which are the Mishkanot, which are spelled with a samach, but it makes the same sound as the sin, that letter, the sin, which this is the letter that is used in the dwelling that Yah commands them to build. So he's like doing a play here on these words. And, this linguistic connection gives us another reason to consider that how it's the building of the tabernacle and these storage cities are related to each other. There's another layer to the pattern here. And if you think about what did they keep in these storage cities? Grain. Which, when you look back to ancient Egypt, that was one of their sources of wealth that sustained their Egyptian empire really for about 3,000 years. And it was Joseph's idea for them to store up this grain. And think about what was stored in the tabernacle. We think about when they're building the tabernacle, they built all of these furnishings, but they had the table of showbread. And in Exodus 25 and verse 30, it says, on the table, you are to place the bread of the presence in my presence always. And so it was storing the bread just like these storage cities were storing the bread. And remember, Yeshua in John 6 says, I'm the bread of life. So not only do these articles point to Yeshua being, not only do they point to Yeshua, but they also point to, this pattern of the bread being housed in this storage, this tabernacle. And in the Holy of Holies, not only do we have the ark, but we have the tablets of stone put in there. And, similarly to the grain, these tablets of stone, have the word inscribed on them, and they are the source of life. They're the source from which the Jewish nation derives its strength. And so that grain, that bread where they're getting their strength is from his word. And that is also a picture of where the Egyptians were storing and getting their source was from a grain. Okay. Not only that, I did read about they were forced into hard labor. And that word for hard labor is Be'od Avodah Kasha. And Avodah is also the word for work. It comes from the root avad, which again takes us back to the garden. If we go to Genesis chapter 2, and I'm going to go back to verse 5. Yet there was as yet no wild bush on earth, and no wild plant had yet sprung up, for Yah Elohim had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no one to cultivate the ground. And Yah Elohim, I'm going to skip down to verse 15. And Yah Elohim took the person and he put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and care for it. Now, in both of those verses, in verse 5 and in verse 15, it used the word cultivate. And that's the English translation I was using. But in the Hebrew, it's using the root avad, okay, to work. So Adam's work was to be in the garden. It was to work and cultivate the garden, okay? Yah's chosen was to be about his word. And we see the chosen seed in Egypt. They're doing work now, but they're building these pagan buildings. And so Yah is going to bring them out to basically bring them back to their original work. Because remember why they were told to come out of Egypt. You remember we go Exodus chapter 7, verse 26. Depends on which version you're reading. It might be chapter 8, verse 1. Exodus 7:26 or 8 verse 1 says, Yah said to Moshe, go into Pharaoh and say to him, here is what Yah says, let my people go so that they can worship me. The Yah Avadini, me. Okay. And that is Avadini, is to worship. The worship is the same word. It's from that same root, or worship or serve, depending on which version you're reading, is the same root as the word avodah, which is work. So our work is to worship is work. We see this also. I found a couple other places. I'm going to go to Joshua chapter 24 and verse 15. Now, if it seems bad to you to serve Yah, then choose this day whom you are going to serve. Will it be the gods of your ancestors beyond the river, or the gods of the Emori in whose land you are living? But as for me and my household, we will serve Me'avod Yah. Okay, Me'avod. That again, avad is the root. Okay, and Numbers 3. Numbers 3 and verse 6. Summon the tribe of Levi and assign them to Aharon the Cohen so that they can help him. They are to carry out his duties and the duties of the whole community before the tent of meeting in performing the service of the tabernacle. They are to be put in charge of all the furnishings of the tent of meeting and to carry out all the duties of the people of Israel connected with the service of the tabernacle. So again, that word service is from that root avad. So their worship, the Levites, their worship is work. It is that same work. So when we think about what they were doing, their work, they were working, building something for these pagan gods. And yet Yah is going to restore them by bringing them out. They're going to be building his tabernacle, and their work now, their worship is their work. Okay, so I'm going to go on to another picture of the pattern link, and let's go to Exodus chapter 2, talking about the birth of Moshe. In verse 1, a man from the family of Levi took a woman, also descended from Levi, as his wife. And when she conceived and had a son, upon seeing what a fine child he was, she hid him for 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took a papyrus basket, coated it with tar, and clay, and put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the riverbank. His sisters stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river, while her maids and attendants walked along the riverside. And spotting the basket among the reeds, she sent her slave girl to go get it. And she opened it and looked inside, and there in front of her was a crying baby boy. Moved with pity, she said, "This must be one of the Hebrews' children." So baby Moshe is placed in this like basket, okay? And the Hebrew word is teva. And that's, we talked about this before. This is the same word for the ark, Noah's ark, okay? But something else in verse 2 here. Remember, I said that linking Moses with the light, that key tov. Well, that first letter of the word tov is a tet. And you can't really see this, but unless you're looking at a Torah scroll, but this is an enlarged letter. And, it's that first letter of the word tov. And it's enlarged in this word, and the tet looks like a basket, okay? It's a vessel. And so it looks like this basket, and literally the tet in Paleo Hebrew is meaning to surround. And so it is basically concealing, because if something is in a basket, it's concealing or it's hiding something. You can't see what is in there. And so this teva, this ark, is placed on the waters of the Nile, and it is hovering over the waters. Just like Noah's ark, rose and hovered above the waters. That's one layer. But if we go back a little farther, let's go back and look at the pattern with creation. In Genesis 1:2, the earth was unformed and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the water. So this ark, this teva, is a picture of the Ruach, and the Ruach is hovering over the waters. And, like I just said, there's this another connection with creation and the Avodah work, because that creation, man was working or worshiping. Adam was working or worshiping in his house, in the garden, which was basically the temple. And then when we look at this word teva in Hebrew, it's spelled tav beit hey. Tav beit hey is the word teva. But if you look at it backwards, because what happens when Adam sinned, the world basically becomes decreation. It's upside down. And so when we look at that word teva backwards, it is tav beit hey. Okay. Tav beit hey is teva, but when we look at it backwards, it is hey beit tav. Hey beit tav, which is habayit. Okay. Or habeit, which is the house. So habeit or habayit in Israel is always referencing, when you're talking about the house, it's always in reference to the temple, the house of God. So there's another link to the what they're building. Okay, so Moshe was pulled out of the waters here, by Pharaoh's daughters, maiden, whatever. And this has another layer, because think about Genesis 1:9. God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered together in one place, and let dry land appear." And that's how it was. So he's basically, Yah was pulling the dry land up out of the waters. And this is also a picture that we see, with the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea. And so this theme, this motif, is making a way through the sea, when Yah makes a way through the sea. And that's an echo that's found in the story of Noah, because the ark and the flood, here we know that they drifted on top of the waters, and then land came up, and the ark rested. And so again, the Moshe's birth story, Yah is making a way for his people through pulling out of the water. Moshe was pulled out of the water. He's like a picture of the ground here that's pulled out. It was that salvation was coming from the seas, was pulled out from the seas. And, this is something else that I think when we're looking at the story that we don't pay attention to the details in the text. Because we've got Pharaoh's daughter, she's this princess of Egypt, and, she's got her maidens in attendance with her, accompanying her, and she's going to bathe in the River Nile. And if you think about the Nile River, if you look at Africa, it's starting at the bottom and goes up, and it is the river that flows from south to north. Okay, so the bottom part of Egypt, so we tend to think of the northern part where the children of Israel lived as the top, but that is lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is down at the bottom, okay, because the Nile flows that way, south to north. And the Nile is full of cataracts, these rapids, but not only that, but it's also full of crocodiles and dangerous fish and other dangers that's, very common to big rivers like the Nile. And so it's unusual to have the daughter of Pharaoh going to bathe or wash in the river. And, why would she be doing that? Because they had bathhouses, they had, if this was just for her to take a bath, that would have normally been done in the palaces of Pharaoh in his house, because they had pools for bathing and washing in every one of their palaces, and they even had warm water running there. So why would Pharaoh's daughter be going down to the Nile unless it was for religious purposes? And I actually found some information, and I'll put it in the description box, the link, that, we know that the Nile is considered like a god, and that Pharaoh's daughter was actually not going out and just really bathing to cleanse herself. She was doing more of a ritual cleansing, like in worship, like we would think about a mikveh or a baptism. Okay. And so I started looking up, and one of the things I found was that two of the most important purification rituals, considered vital preludes to engaging in spiritual activities or into entering a holy space like a temple, were ritual washings and ritual bathings. And very often in ancient Egypt, this was done in the sacred river of the Nile. Sorry. And so those who were seeking a spiritual cleansing would often undergo a ritual bath, symbolizing the washing away of the physical impurities, as well as all the negative energies. Oh my goodness. And the flowing waters of the Niles were thought, Nile was often called the lifeblood of Egypt. So this was the life-giving force. It provided the annual overflow, provided the watering for the desert, and so it provided their food, their grain. So it was considered like a life-giving force. And so they believed that the divine properties of the Nile would actually purify the soul and connect you to that God you are worshiping. So this ritual significance is basically thinking that what Pharaoh's daughter is doing here wasn't just she was going out just to bathe in this river, but she was going probably to do some kind of worship either in the temple, and that this was like a spiritual immersion taking place in these waters. Now, I know Dr. Deanna and I have pointed out that, there's a misrepresentation of what we tend to think about this ark looking like. We think about this little bitty basket that's covered over, but it's probably looking more like ancient Egyptian boats. Let me see if I can share this link with you here. Okay, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see. I will put this link also in the description box so that you can go there too and see. Oops, I closed it. Sorry. Okay. So this is talking about the ancient boats of the Egyptians, and these are some that were found. And it's called the boats of the divinities, and these were used in religious ceremonies for different deities. And you can see how it has like the center compartment here. This was the sacred barge of Horus, that was actually found in the Edfu temple that's still in Egypt. You can see them on the reliefs. This one's the one of Horus. And what's interesting here is in this inner chamber, that's where the gods resided. And so this is another like a statue or like that was made out of bronze that was depicting those boats. Okay. So they had them smaller, they had them larger. So especially with these ancient Egyptian kings, these pharaohs, you would see them using these boats. Now, thinking about that boat, each one of these boats had its own significance. And the importance was it was linking the mortal with the divine, because they were really built for the kings or pharaohs to carry them basically on their journey through the underworld. And these boats, like I showed you, had that inner chamber in the center. Okay. And it was closed up. Those were like the temples. That's where the gods would dwell on the boats. And so when Pharaoh's daughter saw this little boat, and it had this inner chamber because it was closed, she had to open it. She would recognize that Moshe, this baby that's in here, for her mindset, I'm coming down to this river for a religious purpose. And now I see one of these religious boats, and out of it is this child. And so she's thinking, probably that this Moses is a god that's been raised up out of the Nile River, and he's going to be the king. And so it makes sense of why she's able to take this Hebrew child into the palace, and he's going to be raised under Pharaoh. Because why would Pharaoh want to accept a Hebrew child? I mean, you thought about that? I mean, why would he want to accept it? Because this would have been, something, he was trying to kill the Hebrew children. Unless, she's telling in the story, he came up out of the river, and they're looking at it like he is a god. This recreation.
What size you're saying it was?
They have small ones, but they also have the big ones. And I've got the pictures I'm going to show you. Yeah.
Being an R, and she said she had to open it.
Yeah, because the center part of it was made like a boat like this. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That it was closed. So it was, yeah. And it was pitched, and it was like the inner chamber of a temple.
It's kind of like Noah's Ark.
Right, exactly. And that's that same word teva. And then when you think about, like I said, that word teva in Hebrew is the word for ark, but when you look at it backwards, it is the word for the house, which the temple is the house of God. And who resides in the house of God but Yah himself? So in Exodus chapter 7, remember what Yah says about Moshe. In Exodus 7:1, says, but Yah said to Moshe, I put you in the place of God to Pharaoh, and Aaron will be your prophet. But Moses, you're going to be like God to Pharaoh, which is basically what Pharaoh was thinking, raising him as a son. And so Moshe is named and raised by Pharaoh's daughter as an Egyptian. And, Moshe is a common name in Egypt and as well as in Israel, and it means an Egyptian born or a son, because the S or ES or whatever is the last part of Ramses, which means to birth. Okay. And so in Hebrew, Moshe is spelled Mem Shin Hey. But if you read it backwards, Hey, Shem, Mem, it is Hashem, which is the name. So Moshe is to be a reflection of the name. He's a reflection, that's what we're called to. We're called to reflect Yah to others. Mm-hmm. Now, I wanted to reference some Orthodox Jewish sources here and look at what they're saying. Rabbi Ari Khan and Moreh Haish wrote about Moshe, and this is what he says. Therefore, we see that not only does Moshe have an Egyptian name, but his name is steeped with idolatrous connotations. How ironic that the Savior of the Jews should be seen as a god by the Egyptians. And the Midrash Rabbah, Bamidbar 11:2. I'll put the link in. Mm-hmm.
So you really think that they would have known he was Hebrew for sure? Mm-hmm. And the only reason it was there was
because she automatically said this is one of the Hebrew children.
So not wanting to kill it because of the deity.
Yeah, because they're seeing it as him as a deity.
Because that's the way the pharaohs were supposed to go in the ship.
Right.
When they died, that's how they depleted it.
Why would Pharaoh not have killed him?
Yeah, it makes sense.
And in Midrash Rabbah, it says, my beloved is like a gazelle. As the gazelle appears and then disappears, so first Redeemer appeared and disappeared. Rabbi Berkaria, in the name of Rabbi Levi, said, like the first Redeemer was, so the final Redeemer will be. The first Redeemer was Moshe, who appeared to them and then disappeared. The final Redeemer will also appear to them and disappear, for he will disappear from their sight and then again appear to them. So look at what he's saying. They're saying that the Redeemer, the final Redeemer, is going to appear and disappear. Which is a picture of Yeshua, that he's going to die and disappear from sight, but then he's going to come back to reappear again. And also Rabbi Shlomo Majesek says in his book, A Preface to Mashiach, it says, this is what happened with Moshe Rabbeinu in Egypt. He came and then he was concealed for a few months. There are different opinions about how many months. And then he was revealed again and he took the Jews out of Mitzrayim. The Midrash concludes the same thing will be with the Mashiach. He will be revealed, then he will be hidden, and then he will be revealed again. In fact, the Midrash says that he will be, that when he will be hidden, it will be a very difficult time. There will be people who will stop believing in him because of that, and that ultimately he will come. So, like I said, think about what Orthodox Judaism is saying here in reference to, Moshe being a redeemer. But just as the first redeemer Moshe was, they're saying the final redeemer, Mashiach, is going to be that way. And that just as Moshe was concealed, in the opposite of Israel in Egypt, so too the Mashiach is going to be concealed, and then later the opposite of Israel. Where is Mashiach concealed? In Edom, and they're basically saying that Yeshua is hidden in Christianity, like Joseph and Moshe were both concealed in Egypt, and that's coming from Orthodox Judaism. So
it was his father.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So,
Moses.
Oh, Moses. Oh, Amram.
Amram. How do you spell that?
Amram.
That's the Levi they're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And Jochebed. Yeah.
Yeah. And Jochebed. Mm-hmm. Amram was Moses' father's name. Moses' father.
Who was Moses' father?
Amram.
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 And that you can see that in Exodus chapter 6, verse 20. It says that Amram took Jochebed. Yeah. Exodus 6:20. It gives his name.
6:20. So you look it up.
So,
Exodus 6:20.
so think about what happens to Moshe later. Okay. Moshe goes into exile after he murdered his Egyptian brother. Now, remember, I'm looking at the patterns back with creation. So if we go back to creation in Genesis, think about what happened with Cain. Cain goes into exile after killing his brother Havel or Abel. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 16. So Cain left the presence of Yah and lived in the land of Nod, wandering east of Eden.
East of Eden.
East of Eden. Okay. Now let's look at this parsha. Go to Exodus chapter 2 and look at this pattern. Verse 11. One day, when Moshe was a grown man, he went out to visit his kinsmen, and he watched them struggling at forced labor. And he saw an Egyptian strike a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen, and he looked this way and that. And when he saw that no one was around, he killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. The next day, he went out and he saw two Hebrew men fighting with each other. To the one in the wrong, he said, "Why are you hitting your companion?" And he retorted, "Who appointed you ruler and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian?" Moshe became frightened. Clearly, he thought the matter has become known. When Pharaoh heard it, he tried to have Moshe put to death, but Moshe fled from Pharaoh to live in the land of Midian. One day, as he was sitting by the well, okay, so stop right here. What did you just say about Cain? Where did he go? Where did Cain go? East of Eden. Okay.
Yeah.
So he went to Nod, east of Eden. Where does Midian go? I mean, where does Moshe go? But to Midian. Where's Egypt? Where's Midian? East. So Moshe went from Egypt to Midian. So think about what the pattern was. The violence against their brother led to exile. Just like the violence that they did to Joseph led to them being in Egypt in exile.
Was that Moses' act? Was it murder, or was it out of just anger? Not really murder.
Yeah.
Plan,
Well, it's still, he still killed him,
Yeah.
So
the difference between, because it talks about when you kill somebody, there's different ways you kill them.
Yeah.
Not being murder.
Yeah, but I think too, when you're looking at the war, a city of refuge. Okay, and I did find something with that too. So let's keep going. In Exodus chapter 3, look at this, verse 1. Now Moshe was tending the sheep of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Leading the flock to the far side of the desert, he came to the mountain of God, to Horeb. And the angel of Yah appeared to him in a fire blazing from the middle of a bush. And he looked and he saw that although the bush was flaming with fire, the bush was not being burned up. And Moshe said, "I'm going over and see this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't being burned up." So the bush was burning and it wasn't extinguished. It didn't burn out. It didn't consume this tree or this thorn bush. Okay. And this made me think about, if we're looking at this all back to creation and being a pattern, what else was continually burning? In Exodus chapter 27, verse 20, you are to order the people of Israel to bring pure olive oil, pounded olives, for lighting the menorah, and to keep a lamp burning continually. So the menorah was to be the continual light, the ner tamid. Okay. Well, the menorah, just like the burning bush, wasn't to be extinguished. It was to be continuous. It was to have a ner tamid, a continuous light. And the menorah was to be the light for our path to show us the way.
I guess that's when you look at the burning bush, God was in the burning bush, but he wasn't.
The bush,
The
yeah.
bush wasn't God.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot of people, has God in them, but they're not God.
Right. And so this burning bush was the same. It was revealing the path for Moshe. And remember what Yah told Moshe to do when he encountered that burning bush? He was to take off his sandals because he was standing on holy ground. Okay. Well, you think about the menorah. The menorah was placed in the holy place. It was on holy ground. And what was the menorah patterned after?
The one in heaven.
Yeah, which looked like what? What did it have on it?
You talking about the cups?
Uh-huh.
Almond.
Almond tree. Okay. What was the almond tree back in Genesis 1?
It's kind of specific.
The tree of light, the luz, the light. Okay. But
which was another name for Jerusalem.
Yeah, and it was,
That's where the Garden of Eden was.
which was what was in the Garden of Eden.
East of Eden.
Yep. What was in the garden though? The tree of life. So when we look at this, the burning bush that Moses is encountering is a picture of the tree of life, which is also a picture of the menorah in the temple.
Do you think that burning bush was the tree of life?
I don't think, no, I think the bush itself is not, but it's a picture of that, that it's representing that. It's that same pattern that he's using, because when you look, it is that Shnei bush, it was a thorn bush.
Because that tree of life in the Garden of Eden was depicting the one in heaven.
Right.
But it wasn't the one in heaven, right?
Right.
It wasn't.
So when you look at this parsha at another deeper level, Egypt, Mitzrayim, is not just a place, but it's also a spiritual condition. And remember, I said that Mitzrayim means like the straits, the narrow straits, okay? So Pharaoh represents the worldly view that's in opposition to Yah.
It's amazing how Yah used all the Nebuchadnezzar, Pharaoh, all those evil men to do his bidding.
Yeah. And so this thorn bush, the Shnei, is the burning bush. And when you look at the Shnei, we've seen, driving through the Judean wilderness, you see those little bitty thorn bushes, everywhere.
Yeah.
They're not anything great or big, but in the desert, it was not an uncommon sight to see a bush burning, especially in the summer, it gets so hot.
Yeah.
But what was unique was the fact that this bush wasn't being consumed.
It couldn't talk either.
Yeah. And it was, the Shnei is the lowest, most humble of plants, but yet it is burning with an holy fire here. And so if we're thinking about this in another level, like Moshe saw it. He just could have kept going thinking, oh, I've seen a burning bush, whatever. But he turned aside and recognized that there was an eternal flame here. And so each one of us has an inner Egypt. Each one of us has this inner Pharaoh. And each one of us is going to have like this burning bush experience. But the question is, are we going to turn aside and see the eternal flame of Yah? Or are we going to just keep going in what we're doing? because like, Moshe, most of us at one point or another, we felt, think about what happened to Moshe. He starts questioning. We felt overwhelmed. We felt unqualified. We felt uncertain. We felt stuck. We feel small. But yet redemption began when he turned aside. It didn't begin when he says, "Oh, I'm ready." Or, now I'm qualified. Now I've got this. It didn't begin then. It is not when you feel ready. It's not when you feel strong. It's not when life is easy. It is when you turn aside to him. Another thing that I wanted to look at here is a theme that stuck out to me was here in Moshe's life. We see, and this parsha is different than a lot of the other parshas because, most parshas we see men are very dominant. We see, this is a patriarchal society. We see most of the time a lot of women are not named. Okay. But yet in this parsha, most of the main characters are all women. And here in Moshe's life, there are actually 7 women that rescued or saved Moshe. And without them, he wouldn't have been where he was. So those 7 women, just to name them, are Shiphrah and Puah, which were the two, what do you call it? Midwives. I was trying to think of the word midwives. The 2 midwives, we have Jochebed, his mother, Miriam, his sister, Pharaoh's daughter, and her maidservant that pulls him out, and then Zipporah, his wife. So there are 7 women who rescue Moshe. So Shiphrah and Puah, the 2 midwives, defy Pharaoh's orders, and they allow these Hebrew boys to be born. Then we see Jochebed, Moshe's mother, she defies and hides Pharaoh for 3 months. I mean, not Pharaoh, but hides Moshe for 3 months. She's saving his life. Miriam watches over him as he's put in this teva and put out on the water. And she walks along, aside and is watching what happens. She's protecting. Then we see Pharaoh's daughter. She sees the ark and she sends her maidservant to go retrieve it. And then Miriam, of course, steps in and she asks, "Can I go get a wet nurse for you?" And, knowing that's her brother. And so she ends up bringing Jochebed, his own mother, in, and Pharaoh's daughter raises Moshe. Okay. So Shiphrah, Puah, Jochebed, Miriam, Pharaoh's daughter, her daughter's maidservant. That's 6 women right there so far in that little story that saved Moshe's life. And then we get to Zipporah, okay? Because when he leaves and he goes to Midian, Zipporah provides, a family, stability for him, a house, whatever, while he's trying to figure out his mission. But remember what happens at the burning bush after that. Okay, I'm going to go to Exodus chapter 4 and look at what happens here. Exodus 4:24. Now, at the lodging place on the way, Yah met Moshe and would have killed him had not Zipporah taken the flint stone and cut off the foreskin of her son. And she threw it at his feet, saying, "What a bloody bridegroom you are for me." But then God let Moshe be, and she added, "a bloody bridegroom because of the circumcision." So think about this. We see Zipporah and Moshe are leaving, and On the way, he encounters Yah at a lodging place, and Yah's going to kill him. And Moshe is saved because of Zipporah's actions.
Is it Yah? Because no man can see Yah and live.
It says that Yah met him,
But I wonder how,
and would have killed him.
how that was, because Yah told Moshe himself at time.
Yeah.
No man can see me if I put you.
Right. Is it through Yeshua? Yeah. Is it the messenger of him? Is it Yeshua that he's seeing you?
Yeah, I don't know.
But think about this. We aren't told why Yah was going to kill him. But Yah told him to go. Why is all of a sudden Yah going to kill him?
I guess because of the covenant, he had been circumcised.
He has.
No, I said it.
The child.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is what I found in the IVP commentary. It mentions, and the text has told us here, that no one in Egypt was seeking to kill Moses. But Moshe still stood guilty of bloodshed before God.
Well,
And you mentioned this earlier because of the cities of refuge.
yeah.
The cities of refuge later are established to provide a shelter for someone who, committed, a homicide, wasn't premeditated murder.
Yeah.
But look at what they had to do. When the cities of refuge were established, they had to go to that city and they stayed there. They did not leave. Moshe went to Midian.
Yeah.
He sought refuge in Midian. But by leaving the place of refuge, Moshe becomes vulnerable to being called into account for his crime.
What's the time is that stay
Until the high priest died later.
to the high priest?
Mm-hmm. Because the high priest was the ransom for them. Okay.
It could have been a long time.
Yeah. So when you think about what happened here, we see that there's others in the Old Testament that
Well,
Yah calls on them to go somewhere, but on the way, something happens, okay, like Yaakov and Bilam, okay? And in each one of those instances, God indeed wanted them to make the journey, but they had something in their life that they had an issue they had to settle before they could proceed. In Numbers 35, this is later where the cities of refuge comes up, and it says, in verse 25, and the community is to save the killer from the next of kin of the avenger. And the community is to return him to the city of refuge to which he fled. And he is to live there until the Kohen Hagadol was anointed with the holy oil dies. But if the killer ever goes beyond the limits of the city of refuge that he fled to, and the next of kin avenger finds him outside the city limits of the city of refuge, and the avenger kills the killer, he will not be guilty of the man's blood. So he had to stay there. So was Yah establishing a pattern that if you take shelter in a city of refuge, that you can't leave until blood was shed? And so
where was that at? The blood was shed with
in Numbers 35, 25. Mm-hmm. And so is it connecting the fact that when they come into Egypt, think about Moshe and Zipporah are going to be living not in Pharaoh's house. They're going to be living with the Hebrews. They're going to be living in a Hebrew house. And that Yah gave Zipporah supernaturally, I guess, the knowledge that this child needed to be circumcised, because just like, we're going to see the Passover, the blood of the Passover lamb had to be applied to the home of the Hebrews at Passover. And think about what she did. In the English, we read that she threw it at his feet, but in the Hebrew, it's actually she's putting the blood on his feet. That she touched him with the blood, that she's touching the house. She's touching the house, Moshe, with the blood, just like the house at Passover was applied with blood. And remember, how all this is tying back. Are these 7 women tying back to creation, like the 7 days of creation, and that it's through these 7 that the restoration of what was broken in the world is now restored. So, okay. So that's a lot of information and a little bit of time. But it is looking at the pattern instead of like going through and picking apart the story, but looking, hopefully you're looking at it in a different way and seeing that what is happening in Exodus is actually Yah taking and trying to bring creation back to what it was meant to be again. And that this happens over and over and over again throughout Scripture. So, okay, do y'all have anything else? No?
Amen.
Y'all on
Okay.
here, y'all want anything? Y'all have anything y'all want to share or no, or questions online?
Excellent study, though.
It's a little different. So I wanted to look at it a little differently this year. And, like I said, showing how it's a reoccurring theme that's taking place. So, okay, let me get back.
You cover it so beautifully.
What now? I'm sorry, I missed that.
You cover it so beautifully.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
you think about it, think about everything that God set up from Moshe being put in. The only way he could be saved was to be put in that, don't call it an ark, bushel, whatever, but it was, and how God orchestrated everything just perfectly, and then tying into where Moses had killed the guy, and you kind of forgot that until.
But y'all's gonna hold him accountable for it.
Yeah, he's got to be held accountable for it to go in that city of refuge.
And so think about the blood of the high priest is what the blood had to be shed in order for the release. And so the blood was shed that it released him.
Blood, you had to have blood, for a lot of
Release,
things.
yeah.
To release.
And to think about that ransom, that it basically was like a ransom for him. So,
and think about how long he had to stay. Actually, he'd had to stay in that city of refuge for as long as the
high priest
lived. So, wow, that would have been a long time.
Well, which is a picture of what? Of Yeshua, because we are guilty of his death.
Yeah.
We are guilty of justifiable homicide, basically, because it's for our sins that he died. So therefore, what happens? We run to the city of refuge, which is him.
Yeah.
Okay, we're running to him, but upon his death, we are ransomed.
Yeah.
So when Yeshua died, we were ransomed.
That's so good. That is so good.
And to think about, if you go all the way back to the beginning, like I said, that, when we look at that Moses being born and he's called a goodly child, that it really wasn't just, he's this fat little chubby baby that's really pretty with these chubby cheeks. It is, he was keto, taking it back to the light in Genesis 1, that's talking, it's making him a picture of Yeshua. That the light, he was the light of the world. Yeshua is the light of the world. Moshe was the light of the world. So.
Amen.
Okay.
If everybody want to get ready, we'll have the blessing over the congregation.
We ready?
Okay. You ready? Okay.
Ready.
Yeberekaka Yahava Virishmei Reha Yahir Yahava Peneva Ileka Vehuneka Yesaya Pinari leka, vayashim leka, shalom. May Yah bless you and keep you. May Yah make his face to shine on you and show you his favor. May Yah lift up his face toward you and give you peace. B'Shem Yeshua HaMashiach, Sar Shalom. Go in peace. Amen. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom. And we have to always remember, as long as we love Yah, God's going to put us in a place of refuge, in a place of protection, in a place because his children, he orders our steps, is what the word says. Because why? We're his people.
Right.
We're his sheep. He's the shepherd. He watches after us. He keeps us kind of in the crowd because he knows that we have a tendency to sin sometimes. And he has to put us in that place of, a place of refuge, so he can watch after us. He loves us. He's going to be there for us always. Amen.
Amen.
Love
Amen.
y'all. Y'all have a great week.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
Thank you,
Shalom.
Angelina. It's good to see you. Bye, guys. You guys have a great Shabbat.